If you want to learn how to make a top-down dungeon crawler, something inspired by classics like Gauntlet and even Diablo, something that has path-finding enemies and area of effect explosions, something that was the beginning of my own dungeon crawler game, a top-down, couch co-op, action RPG with randomly generated levels and multiple player characters, then keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, and welcome back to our top-down dungeon crawler. In our previous episode, we added gamepad input. In this episode, we expand the game by coding a cool level transition exit, which allows us to then build any number of extra levels. We then talk about how to expand on it by adding these extra effects to the transition. The first thing I'd like to cover though is a quick fix for the previous input tutorial. If you have a gamepad with some stick drift, you might find the player will move slightly when idle. This is a real quick fix and just requires us to set the dead zone for all gamepads at the start of the game. Gamepad input is detected as a value between -1 and 1, but if we set a dead zone of 0.2, it means that any value between -0.2 and 0.2 will be set to 0 instead, effectively stopping any small values that the gamepad is accidentally picking up. So if we go to our game and we go to our create event, we can just add this. And what this will do is loop through the 12 possible controllers that you could have connected, and it'll set their dead zones to 0.2. It doesn't matter if you don't have the controller connected. This will just be done in the create event of our game at the start, and it doesn't need to be done again. It'll just happen once at the start. Now, I also want to make a small gameplay change because the player can simply hold down attack and spam arrows at the enemies. I'd like a very slight delay to the move speed when shooting to make firing your bow more strategic. Now, this is optional. If you don't want to do this, fine, but it's worth trying because it does mean that your player needs to think a bit more about when they're firing. So if we go to OPlayer and go to the create event, so just here I've added a walk speed initial, and that'll just be the initial speed that we are walking at. Now down further where we're doing all the firing, I want to add these two variables. And this value will just be a percentage of the walk speed that we're walking at when we fire. And this will be how long that value is applied. So it means we'll be walking at 70% of our walk speed once we fire, and we'll be doing it for 20 steps. Now, in order to reset this back to our walk speed initial, we can set an alarm and have that reset the walk speed back. So to set an alarm, let's go to our macros. Down here, I'm going to add a walk delay, and this will be our alarm 4 when we set it up in the player. Now, the question is, when do we set the walk speed? Well, when we fire, and we do that in our check fire. So the best place would be just here after we've attacked. So I'm going to add this. So I've just added these two code blocks. And if you're in GML, we're just setting the walk speed to be walk speed times attack walk delay. So we're timesing that 0.7 by walk speed, which gives us 70% of the walk speed. And we're just setting an alarm, our walk delay, which is alarm 4, and we're setting it to our attack walk delay time, which means it'll last for 20 steps. So now we need to create this alarm 4 or the walk delay alarm. So back in our OPlayer, we have alarm 3. Let's add another alarm. And this time I'm going to add this code. So we're just setting our walk speed back to the initial value. Now this is an execute code block, and it enables us to have a description so that when we look at the alarms, you actually can get the description there. So you can use this execute code with the description prefix there to get that to happen. So let's press F5 and test that out. Now when I fire, there's a slight delay. So if I spam, I'm going to go much slower than if I let go of the mouse. The game instantly becomes more strategic. Now let's add an exit to the level and a way to move to a new level. There are many changes we need to make in order for this to happen correctly. When we move to a new room, all instances in the old room get deleted. So the player would get deleted. If we add variables holding information we want the player to keep, like health or gold collected, we would lose that information. We can either get around that by storing those values in global variables, as they are retained when moving between rooms, or we can make the object persistent. That means the object will persist between rooms. The problem with doing that though is if we've created an instance of it by dragging it into the room, that instance is going to be created every time we enter the room. So you'll end up with multiple player or game objects, and that'll mess up your game. The solution I use is to have the game start in an initialization room, which creates any persistent instances and then moves to the room of your game, ensuring they are only loaded once. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to right click here and create an object, and I'm going to call it oInitialization or oInit. And then we're going to add a create event. And in here we can create oGame if it hasn't already been created. So we add a check first to see if oGame has not been created. And if it hasn't, then we can create it just here. Now we can do the same thing for the player. And essentially it's the same code. We're checking if the player exists. If not, then we create it. Now the player gets created on the player layer. So we'll need to make sure that layer exists. And after we've created the instances, we can then go to a certain room, and our room's going to be called RM_level1. So let's go to our rooms, and let's just rename this room. You can press F2 on it, or you can click twice on it, and I'm going to call it RM_level1. Now I'm also going to create a new room. So create room, and this is going to be called RM_initialize or init. Now, currently this room is the home room, and that's the room that's going to be loaded when the game starts. But if you click on the little home, you can move this one up, and now the initialization room will be the first room loaded. So the order here doesn't affect that, but you can drag these around if you like, if you have the custom order selected. Now, inside the initialization room, just make sure over here we have an instances, and we also have a player layer. Now, when the game runs, the first room that loads is what the game uses for the dimensions or the ratio of your game. So if we look at this one, we have 1080 by 720. We need to go back here and make sure that is set the same for the first room that we load. Now, just under our instances, let's put the oInitialization object just there. And let's go into our oGame and make it persistent. And we also need to do the same thing with oPlayer. And we need to do the same thing with oBow, because the bow needs to go with the player as well. Now, because we've made the bow persistent, if we go and look at the player's create event, where we create the bow, we need to only create it if the bow doesn't already exist. So same thing as we've done before, we'll just check if an instance exists, and if oBow does not exist, then we can create it. Now back in our level 1, just make sure we get rid of the player here. It's important. So we only want one copy being created by our initialization object, and we'll get rid of oGame up there. So let's press play and test that out. And now the player starts, but they're up here in the corner. And that's because when we create them in our oInitialization, we create them at the value of 0, 0. So that's where they're going to spawn. So we need a way to position the player for each level when it starts. So I'm going to create a function that'll hold the information for each level. I just wanted to take a break and appreciate who makes these videos possible. Even if you want to join for free, Patreon has numerous tiered memberships to show your support. And they even introduced a free tier just to allow you to follow and see some channel updates. My legendary supporters this month are Big Honk, Jake Dowds, Mark Savage, Pillsbury, Charlie, Dennis, and Midnight. Thank you for your generous support of my channel. It really helps me make the content I do. All legendary Patreon members receive free codes to whatever my current courses are, including this cool Mario-inspired first platformer course I've recently released. Now back to the video. Okay, so let's create the function that'll position the player at the start of each level. So if you're in GML, you want to go to your scripts and you want to create a new script called game processes. But if you're in Visual, you don't need a script to hold them all. You can just create the script directly, and it's going to be called set level info. So let's look at this. And here I'll just put this description. So whenever a room is loaded, it runs some creation code. So we can run this function in that creation code and have a switch statement select the room that we're in, and we can set the values for each one when they load. So if we just go to our switch and we look at the room we are in, and let's add a case here for our RM level 1. It's the only room we have. And right here, I want to create a struct which holds the information for the level. Now in GML, creating a struct is very simple, but in Visual, they don't have a method to create it like that. So what we're going to use is our execute code and just type in the code that you would use for creating a struct within GML as well. Now, if you haven't heard of struct, essentially think of it as a variable, but it lets you hold multiple variables within that one variable. So when you create a struct, you just put the name of it. I'm going to call it global level info STT, standing for struct. And all we do is we want to say it equals some certain values within these brackets. Now here's the information I want to store. So we have a player start position for the X and the Y. We have the total enemies for the level, and we have a spawn chance. And this will be the chance per tile to create an enemy. So now that we have our level 1 struct, we have this set level info function. If we go to our room and we go down here to the creation code, now this code will run when the room starts. So we can run a function call, or if you're in GML, you just type this directly, and we want to set the level info right there. And I'll just add this comment. So now that we have some player start positions for the X and the Y, we need to apply them to the player when the room starts. So if we go to our game and we go to our room start event. So just down the bottom here, if you go all the way to the bottom of this code when we're setting up the room, here we can look at those variables. Because when the room starts, the creation code event runs just before this room start event runs. So we'll get the player start position variables already, and here we'll use them to set the player's position. So here we're trying to set the player's X coordinate to our global level info struct, and then we use a full stop to access any variables within that struct. And we're just accessing that player start position X. And we're doing the same for the Y. Now at the moment, we're setting the X and the Y of OGame. It doesn't know that we want to set the player's position. So we can just go here and say, what do we want to apply this to? Well, we want to apply it to the player. And if you're in GML, you can just say oplayer.x is equal to that value. Now within Visual, you can also say oplayer.x and then set it to this value. And those are doing exactly the same thing. So whichever you're more comfortable with, this way will get you more used to GML, and this way is very much a visual thing. So while we're here, we can use that spawn enemies variable as well. So if we just go here where we're spawning the enemies, instead of using this 0.1, we can use that spawn chance variable instead. And that way you can have different densities of enemies depending on what you set here. And we also have a variable for the total enemies. So we want to make sure that we're not creating more enemies than what we've set in those values. So just here we can get the instant count, and that'll tell us how many particular enemies we have. And I'll store that in a variable just called num. And then we'll have another if expression here to check if that value is less than our value that we have in our struct. So we want to check and see if our num is less than our global level info struct dot total enemies. And if it is, well, then we can continue on. So we'll drag this just up here. And once again, this value needs to check our spawn chance. So you can take a copy of this and just paste it here. But instead of total enemies, we want to use that spawn chance variable. So this will ensure that those numbers are applied correctly when spawning the enemies. Now just back on the level here, I just want to go and make a change. We don't need that anymore. But I just want to cut this off here. So if I hold down P and select it and press A, we can just drag over here and just make sure the room can't be exited because this is where we're going to start, and we'll make the player start right in that spot there. So let's test this out. Okay, so the player did start in the right location. If I press R, yep, that's great. It's starting right where they should. But you'll notice that if I keep respawning, sometimes we get enemies spawning right on top of the player, which is a little unfair. We don't want them to be spawning right on them or even close to them. So we can add a simple check to ensure they can't spawn really close to the player. So if we just go back to that room start event, now I just want to add a little check here. So just here, I'm going to, just above this create instance, I'm going to add this. So we're going to set the random position within the tile to spawn at. So basically we're getting an X and Y position within the tile. And this value is just the position we're spawning at, and I'm just adding a random range value between a quarter of a tile each way. So it'll be somewhere in the middle of the tile. So all this is doing is just giving a random position so they're not all spawning directly in the middle of the tile. So now let's see how far they're going to spawn away from the player. And we can do that with just a function call to point distance. So here we're just getting the distance from the spawn point to the player's start position. And I'm going to store that in a temporary variable called dis. So now we can look at that value, and if it's greater than a certain number, then we can go ahead and spawn the enemy. So just here we can do an if check, and we'll do an if expression and say if our distance is greater than, let's say 128, which is 4 tiles. If that is true, then we'll create the instance. And I'll just add this comment. Now, before we test that out, I just want to change one more thing, and it's up the top in this room start event, just here where we're creating the MP grid. And that's what the enemies use to navigate towards the player. Now, this grid will get created at the start of every room, which wasn't a problem before when we only had one room. But with multiple rooms, this is going to cause a memory leak as we are not destroying the old MP grid from the previous room when we move to a new one. So the simplest solution is let's add a other room end event. Make sure it's not game end or game start. So the room end. And here we can just destroy that MP grid, and you can do it with MP grid destroy. And then you type the name of the grid, and it's just called global.mpgrid. So then it'll be created every time in the room start event again. So let's press play and test that out. If we press R lots and lots of times, we can make sure that no enemies ever get within these 4 tiles of the player. This is the maximum distance where they can be created. Great, that works. I just wanted to pause for a moment and thank the epic supporters for this video. They are Chris LeBlanc, Dennis Evans, Joseph Carmelo, Marlo Dobby, Logan H, Stephen Givens, Matthew Kuipert, Matthew Lim, Joshua Young, and Dave Guy. Thank you so much for your support. Now let's continue. Now we need an exit tile the player can touch in order to exit the level. So let's go to the current tile set. Now I'll just make this bigger because we're going to do this in both GML and visual. So under our tile sets, we're after not the tile set itself, but the sprite. And here we can edit the image. and we'll just add another tile. Now I realize that even though I said we're going to try to make Gauntlet, our game isn't exactly Gauntlet or the classic Gauntlet. It's a top-down shooter, but I'd like to show you how to do a few things that are similar to the classic Gauntlet. Now the exit in that look like this. So it's just a dark block with the word exit on it, and when they touch it, they spin around and disappear. So let's make the exit look the same. So just here, I can hold down Control and use wheel mouse to zoom in and out. I'm going to hold down O and grab this pixel. And down here, we're going to paste it here. So I'm just going to grab this and select a box and then press F to fill that in. And then we can draw, if I swap these over and change this to a white, we can draw the word exit here. So I'll just do this very quickly. Now note that I can use the left mouse button for white and the right mouse button for the background color. And that's why I did the swap, so that I can basically delete it as I go. All right, so let's add these letters too. And done. So if we go back out, we have the exit sign there. And if we go back to our room, we can create another layer just above our tiles for our wall, and we'll just call it tiles exit. And we need to assign the tile set that we have, and then we can apply an exit anywhere we like. Now, because we're going to jump between rooms, I'm also going to go and back here under our sprites, I'm going to add a new sprite and just call it num. And if we go to edit image, I'm going to choose a font here, and let's just get Arial Black because it's nice and bold, and we'll choose a size, say 30, and we'll put the number 1, do plus, number 2, 3, and 4. So even though they are all out of whack, if I choose the number here, I can move it around, and if I press 1 and 2, I can jump back and forth between the images, and we can align them very quickly that way. So now that we have those, we'll go back here and we'll set their value to 0 for the frames. And if we go to our room, we can create an asset layer, and this is room 1. So I'm just going to take that number and hold down Alt and then just put it in the corner there. Now you don't want to leave this permanently. It's just for our testing, so you can see easily when I jump between rooms what's happening. And the reason I wanted to do all of that is before we duplicate our room, by doing all of that, the duplication means that those things will stay with the room when we duplicate it for the next level. So just right click on your room and say duplicate, and this one's going to be level 2. So double click that to load it. And here we want to create a new level. So hold down P and select this. And if we go down here, we can change this to frame 2. This is going to be our number 2, so we know what we're working on. I know we can read it here, but when you play the game and jump between the rooms, it'll make much more sense. So a quick way to clean the room out is you can select the walls, hold down, I'll press S once, and then select all of this and press delete. You can do it for the floor marks if you have those, and the floor shadow if you have those, and just right click to deselect that. And now you can go ahead and create a room. So make sure you select tiles wall, go over here to the room editor, and under our library, make sure you have wall selected and press A, and you'll get the auto drawing that we already set up. So what I'm going to do is just do an outline here all the way around, and then it's up to you to fill in your level as you'd like. If you want to see what mine looks like, here it is completed. So there's the completed level. You can go ahead and make yours however you like. If you do want to change the size of the level, you sometimes need to click off and then click back on, and then you'll be presented with the room size, and you can change that here. I'm going to keep it the same for this one, but in the next room, I'll make a change and we'll have it as a different size. So the other thing just to do, I'm going to change this to and just move it over to here. And I want to change the player's spawn position. So we can add that X and Y position to the set level info function. So right here, the value of the position's down here. So when I hold my mouse over, it's about 192 by 64. So if we press Control T and we go to our set level info function, now we can have another case and we'll have the info just like here. So I'm going to copy this and paste, and that'll appear down here, and we'll change this to level 2. And the value I mentioned was 192 and 64. Now we might want some more enemies because we have more space here, and I'll also set the spawn chance to be something a little higher. So the only other thing was to place the exit tile. Now for this level, I'm going to place it up here, but for testing, I'm just going to put one over here for the moment just so we can test it out. And for our level 2, I want to exit just here and one here. Now we need a way for the player to touch the exit tile and have them move to another room. So let's just create an object to do this, and the collision event will enable that to happen. So if we go back to our assets, let's create a new object called O_exit. And we also are going to need a sprite. So let's create a sprite here called S_exit. And I'm going to change the size to 32 because that's the size of our tiles. And apply that. And then if we edit the image, we can select, say, a yellow color and make it a lower alpha. And we'll just press F to fill that in. Now, if we close that and close this and go back to our exit, we can drag that across and assign it. Now, I'm also going to make it non-visible because we don't want to see the yellow exit. All we need to see is the tile with the word exit on it. So back in our room, let's take the exit, and it's the object of the exit. And let's put it in our instances. And if I hold down Alt, I can get the object and drop an instance of that object there. And we'll put one over here too. Inside this object, we can look at the creation code and we can add this. So here we're just assigning the target room to be the room we want to go to when we touch this instance. And in this case, it's room level 2. So we'll just take a copy of this and we'll put that over here as well into the other exit. And lastly, let's have a collision with the player and the exit. So all that we want to happen is the player to be teleported to a specific room, and that is the target room. Now this target room variable doesn't exist in the player, it exists in the exit. So if we do this, we're going to get an error. So instead we need to say other.targetRoom, and that'll get the target room variable from the exit instance. So let's press play and test that out. So now when we touch the exit, we should be teleported to room 2 instantly. Great, that works. Now the advantage of setting it up like this is we can have multiple exits in one level, and they can lead to different levels. So for example, if you have a level 3 and a 4, you could have this as an exit to level 4 and this one as an exit to level 3. It means that if you take this one, you've still got to go through level 3, but if you go the longer distance, you can skip a level effectively. And by having the target room inside the instance here that we place, that enables it to happen. So now that we have the basics working, we can improve on it by adding some polish. And this technique works well when you create your own game. You get the basics of what you want working, and then you can build on it and add more features over time. You don't want to try to implement the final version as your first draft. So I'd like the player to move to the middle of the exit and then teleport to the next level. And then we can add some effects as well. Now this tutorial is already quite long, so if you want to see that, I'll put that in the next tutorial. Creating these videos at the level of quality I do takes a huge effort. And if you've made it to the end, it means you must have appreciated the content I put out. Patreon has a free tier where you can follow my game dev journey and also pick up any helpful posts I put on the site for those free tier members. Thank you to these rare supporters for this month, but if you want to see more of my content, there are also other tiers where you can contribute to help support the channel. If that's not for you, then at least subscribe to the channel, because that also helps. Thanks for watching, I'll talk to you in the next one.